Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is June 8th, 2021. I'm Matt Van Valkenburg, a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to our lecture. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We especially thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. Without your membership, we would not be able to host this lecture series. We would love to have you join us. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support the world's first and oldest Korea studies organization. For 121 years, we have strived to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. Members receive our annual journal, Transactions. Members of RAS Korea are also recognized by most of Asia's RAS-affiliated societies, as well as the London-based original RAS. See our website at raskb.com for details. A link will be posted in the chat box. If you are not a member, we request a one-time admission fee. Please refer to the donation page on your screen for PayPal and bank transfer information. This information will also be posted in the chat box. We are joined tonight by Dr. Ágota Duró, a visiting researcher at Hiroshima City University. Originally from Hungary, she obtained her PhD in Peace Studies from the Graduate School of International Studies, Hiroshima City University in 2017. She authored articles entitled "A Pioneer Among the South Korean Atomic Bomb Victims, the Significance of the Jin-doo Trial, Medical Assistance for Korean Atomic Bomb Survivors in Japan, Belated Japanese Grassroots Collaboration to Secure the Rights of Former Colonial Victims," and "Historical Counternarratives, Japanese Christians' Advocacy for South Korean Atomic Bomb Victims," published respectively in the Asian Journal of Peacebuilding, the Asia-Pacific Journal, and the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies. Her current research focuses on Japanese and South Korean grassroots and religious movements to repatriate the remains of Koreans buried in wartime Japanese mass graves. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. So let's please welcome Professor Duró.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to share the PowerPoint presentation. So let me see. Okay, is it working? Yes, yes, okay, thank you. Just a moment. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. So today's presentation is a comprehensive study on the history of the atomic bomb survivors residing in South Korea, their litigations in Japan, and the Japanese grassroots movements that have advocated for their rights since the 1970s. The presentation is based on my doctoral dissertation research, but it also contains new information not discussed in the dissertation. During my talk, I will use the Japanese term hibakusha when I refer to the atomic bomb victims from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let me start with a historical background. Victims of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were not limited to Japanese. Approximately 1/10 of all atomic bomb victims, 70,000 people came from the Korean peninsula, and most of the survivors returned to their Korean homeland following Japan's surrender in World War II. Although the atomic bombs indiscriminately killed people of all age groups and nationalities, there is a huge discrepancy between the recorded testimonies of Japanese and Korean victims. Japanese hibakusha first depict that fateful morning, followed by a sudden flash, after which many of them lost consciousness. These stories are narrated without hardly any reference to the Asia-Pacific War, creating the impression that the victims' peaceful lives were suddenly disrupted by a new type of bomb of extremely destructive power. In contrast, South Korean survivors shed light on why they were compelled to leave their homeland for Japan. We can get an insight into their vicissitudes during the colonial era, their status as second-class citizens residing in the Japanese Empire, Japan's systematic cultural assimilation, and the manifold sufferings they had experienced well before being exposed to the atomic bomb. Now, let's take a look at the estimated number of the Korean A-bomb survivors. You can see that the population before the dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima was 420,000, and this number was 271,000 in Nagasaki. So in total, there were approximately 700,000 people in the two A-bomb cities in August 1945. And the total number of Korean A-bomb victims in Hiroshima was 50,000, while in Nagasaki, 20,000. So in total, 70,000 Koreans are estimated to have become victims of the atomic bomb. There were 40,000 Korean people who died in the two cities, while 30,000 survived. Among those who survived, 23,000 repatriated to the Korean peninsula after the Second World War, while 7,000 continued to reside in Japan in the post-war period. Many Koreans migrated to Japan during the colonial period, which lasted from 1910 to 1945 due to oppressive government policies. Following the annexation of Korea in 1910, Japan introduced several measures that precluded the Koreans from maintaining their traditional way of living. The land survey enterprise in the 1910s dictated that any land that did not have certified ownership was confiscated. Japan promoted mulberry growing, silk production, and increased rice cultivation. The imperial regime demanded the improvement of the quality of rice produced in Korea so that it would satisfy the needs of Japanese consumers. Farmers in the countryside, particularly in Hapcheon County, South Gyeongsang province that you can see in the map, where 84% of the population lived from agriculture, were unable to adapt to the radical changes and suffered serious losses. Farmers who lost their land crossed the Sea of Japan in hopes of better living conditions, and a disproportionately large number of Hapcheon residents clustered in Hiroshima from the 1920s. So when we consider the reasons why many Koreans came to Japan before the Second World War, the first reason is what I have mentioned before, the economic measures in Korea. And the second reason was that many Koreans were involved in independence movements that culminated in 1919 and 1920. These dissidents fled to Japan to escape Japanese retaliatory measures in Korea. The third reason was Japan's introduction of military conscription and forced labor system after the outbreak of World War II, which intensified in 1944. And due to this measure, tens of thousands of Koreans were brought forcefully to Japan. the National General Mobilization Law and the National Conscription Order were enacted in 1938 and 1939, respectively, after which Koreans, as Japanese imperial subjects, were obliged to serve Japan in its wartime ambitions. Many Koreans were forcefully brought to the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Hiroshima and to the Mitsubishi shipyard, as well as coal mines in Nagasaki. This explains why a large number of Koreans were residing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, who had become victims not only of Japanese colonization and forced labor, but also of the atomic bombs. In March 1954, Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon No. 5 fishing boat were exposed to nuclear fallout from the hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll. After this disturbing event, Japanese A-bomb survivors publicly voiced the horrors of the atomic bombings they had suffered in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese became increasingly conscious of the threat nuclear weapons pose to humanity and the effects of radiation. Hibakusha support groups were set up, including Nihon Hidankyo, which is the Japanese term for Japan Confederation of Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers, in 1956, and this association was the most influential. Following their repeated appeals, the Japanese government enacted the A-bomb Survivors Medical Care Law in 1957, which guaranteed free medical treatment to hibakusha residing in Japan. Additionally, the Special Measures Law, which came into effect in 1968, provided hibakusha with monthly healthcare allowances. Survivors who were officially acknowledged as A-bomb victims by the authorities in Japan received an atomic bomb certificate that enabled them to apply for benefits from the Japanese government. However, in the post-war period, the lives of the atomic bomb survivors who had repatriated to South Korea took a different turn from those living in Japan. While Japan experienced its economic miracle beginning in the 1950s, the Korean Peninsula struggled through a domestic conflict that culminated in the Korean War. Apart from the millions of casualties, the peninsula suffered massive damage to its economy, and the largest repercussion was the solidification of two separate Korean states, with a communist totalitarian regime in the north and a military dictatorship from 1961 in the south. Additionally, a lack of adequate knowledge on the impact of radiation on the human body led South Koreans to assume that atomic bombing-related diseases were contagious, and people exposed to radiation would have deformed children. Since doctors were also unaware of the acute health effects of radiation for many decades, they mistakenly diagnosed many hibakusha with Hansen's disease, which is a term for leprosy. These misconceptions resulted in discrimination against South Korean hibakusha. Consequently, many of them lived isolated from the rest of Korean society and concealed their hibakusha identity initially to avoid discrimination. South Korea's historical perception of the atomic bomb attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also prevented South Korean society from developing sympathy toward those compatriots who had stayed in the two A-bomb cities at the time of the attacks and in the post-war period had repatriated to the peninsula. For many Koreans, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bomb attacks came to symbolize Japan's punishment for its wartime aggression, and society generally viewed the bomb as a savior that brought about Japan's surrender and put an end to its 36-year rule of the Korean Peninsula. Koreans in the post-war period perceived the dropping of the atomic bombs favorably and assumed it helped liberate them from an oppressive colonial power. Due to the absence of awareness of the long-term effects of radiation in South Korea and the approval of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, hibakusha living in both halves of the peninsula were unable to request provisions or to speak out against nuclear weapons. South Korean A-bomb survivors were trapped in a vicious cycle of disease, unemployment, and poverty, and they were among those with the lowest socioeconomic status. Owing to the lack of a medical insurance system, most were unable to receive medical treatment for decades given the high cost of medical care, and many passed away with their plight largely unknown. The Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute conducted the first survey in 1964 to find out the number of hibakusha in South Korea and identified 203 survivors. Then the Mindan, Korean Residents Union in Japan, investigation group sent a delegation to South Korea in May 1965, 1 month before the signing of the normalization treaty between Japan and South Korea. These events prompted the South Korean government to take steps to identify A-bomb victims in their country. Following the government's request, the Korean Red Cross Society launched another survey in August 1965, this time confirming the existence of 462 more atomic bomb victims. These events began to raise awareness in South Korean society of the existence of atomic bomb victims. Additionally, the Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea, signed by the two countries in 1965, established diplomatic relations and finalized the settlement of all wartime and colonial issues. Nevertheless, regarding the compensation of wartime victims, not a single article in the treaty touched upon their situation, let alone that of the atomic bomb survivors in South Korea. Thus, some hibakusha began to raise their voices against their long-term abandonment and constant suffering and set up their own association in 1967. So I will refer to this association as the Korea Association from now, to demand relief measures both from the South Korean and Japanese governments. These developments made some Japanese citizens conscious of the existence and plight of A-bomb victims living in South Korea. While atomic bomb victims in Japan were eligible for certain state-sponsored medical treatment following the enactment of the two A-bomb relief laws in 1957 and 1968, the same laws were not applicable in South Korea, thus leaving tens of thousands of Korean hibakusha without access to any form of support. When some Japanese citizens came to this realization in the early 1970s, they formed peace movements demanding that the A-bomb relief laws apply to hibakusha living in South Korea the same way they support A-bomb sufferers in Japan. In the process, these Japanese advocates were confronted with Japan's accountability in World War II, the vicissitudes of the colonial period, and Japan's complicity in many Koreans becoming victims of the atomic bomb. Awareness of relief measures to support A-bomb survivors and aspirations for a healthier life inspired more Korean hibakusha to enter Japan and assert their rights. The pioneer who paved the way for his overseas counterparts was Son Jin-doo, followed by long years of litigation against the Japanese government. Son Jin-doo was born in Osaka in 1927, and he became an A-bomb victim in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. He was deprived of his Japanese citizenship after the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and he was deported to Korea in the post-war period. So he entered the country without a valid visa in December 1970, after which he was arrested in Saga Prefecture in Kyushu. Son was interviewed while in custody by two reporters and told them he was a hibakusha from Hiroshima and his intention was to receive free medical treatment in a Japanese hospital. Following coverage in regional newspapers, such as the Chugoku Shimbun and Nagasaki Shimbun, Son's case drew the attention of numerous Japanese, mainly in Hibakusha, Fukuoka, and Osaka, who had a critical understanding of their country's colonial past and wartime aggression. In Hiroshima, one of his earliest sympathizers, who later became his leading advocate, was Hiraoka Takashi, a former correspondent of Chugoku Shimbun and Hiroshima's mayor from 1991 to 1999. The 7-year lawsuit ended on March 30th, 1978, with the Supreme Court's ruling in favor of Son. The verdict stated that the A-bomb laws focus on the special health conditions of hibakusha, and it is a humanitarian legislation designed to help them. Furthermore, the court acknowledges that both atomic bomb laws, apply even to foreign non-Japanese citizens, provided they are hibakusha, and they are entitled to state compensation indicated by both laws. The court admitted that by ignoring these points in the case of someone who is an undocumented immigrant, it means that we disregard the humanitarian nature of the laws. Son Jin-doo's 7-year court battle carries great historical significance. He was the very first Korean A-bomb survivor who initiated a lawsuit in Japan demanding parity with Japanese hibakusha. His case was unique in that he was the first overseas hibakusha who managed to generate a nationwide support movement in Japan. Newspaper reports on the progress of his lawsuits throughout the 1970s raised public awareness of the plight of non-Japanese hibakusha for the first time. The redress movement to advocate for the rights of South Korean A-bomb victims gradually expanded in the 1970s, and a number of Japanese calling for their equal treatment with Japanese A-bomb survivors in terms of healthcare and welfare subsidies gradually increased. A new organization called the Association of Citizens for the Support of the Korean Atomic Bomb Victims was formed in December 1971 in tandem with Son Jin-doo's legal support. It has been the main grassroots organization in Japan campaigning for the rights of Korean atomic bomb survivors since the early 1970s. Besides its central office in Osaka, it has branches in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose members have worked to compel the Japanese government to compensate and recognize South Korean hibakusha. The Association of Citizens has provided direct financial and medical aid to the Korea Association since its establishment. Additionally, its members have visited various parts of South Korea to conduct surveys and gain a profound understanding of the actual situation of the A-bomb victims there, collected signatures all over Japan, and petitioned the Japanese government repeatedly to pay restitution and implement relief measures for overseas hibakusha, and they played a key part in their legal support. Through their publications and exhibitions, they have informed Japanese society about the existence, plight, actual conditions, and history of South Korean A-bomb victims. Next, I'm going to introduce the 3 preeminent supporters representing Hiroshima, Osaka, and Nagasaki, respectively. Toyonaga Keisaburo, an A-bomb survivor based in Hiroshima, became aware of the gravity of the discrimination against Zainichi Koreans as a teacher at Hiroshima Technical High School in the late 1960s. The term Zainichi Korean refers to the Korean people who continued to live in Japan after the Second World War. It was difficult for Zainichi Koreans to find prestigious jobs in Japan then, thus many parents enrolled their children in the Hiroshima Technical High School, hoping that they could rise out of poverty by learning a vocation. Even decades after the war, many Koreans used Japanese names to avoid discrimination. Toyonaga sympathized with the plight of Koreans and encouraged them to cherish their Korean background by using their Korean names. He visited South Korea in August 1971 as a representative of Hiroshima Prefecture to participate in the teacher training program. Before his trip, he had learned about the existence of Korean hibakusha and had wished to meet them. At their headquarters in Seoul, some Korean A-bomb victims explained that neither the South Korean nor the Japanese government had ever assisted them. Furthermore, the repressive policies of the South Korean military dictatorship then in power had sealed them off from the outside world. Their situation shocked Toyonaga, who returned to Japan determined to provide them with immediate assistance. When he learned about the establishment of the Association of Citizens in Osaka from the newspapers, not only did he join the citizen-based group, but he also set up the Hiroshima branch in 1974 and continued to serve as the foremost advocate in the first A-bomb city, collaborating with the central office in Osaka. Ichiba Junko was born in 1956 in Fukuyama, Hiroshima Prefecture. Since living close to Hiroshima City, her parents took her to the Peace Memorial Museum as a child, where she learned about the tragedy of the atomic bombing. However, it was not until the 1970s that she became aware of the existence of Korean victims. She enrolled in Kyoto University in 1975 and moved to the Kansai area, where the largest number of Zainichi Koreans reside in Japan. After meeting some of them, she became acquainted with the colonial history and the large number of Korean A-bomb victims. She took Korean language courses and learned about the history of Korea in detail. By the time she entered university, Matsuda Motoji, the current Secretary General of the Osaka main branch of the Association of Citizens, had already been leading a student circle at Kyoto University for the support of Korean hibakusha. Ichiba joined the student circle upon entering university, which marked the beginning of her involvement in the support of Korean hibakusha. She visited Korea in 1979 to conduct a survey, initially as a member of the Association of Citizens delegation. She met with Shin Yeon-soo, who was then chairperson of the Korea Association. As Ichiba related, hibakusha's living circumstances were much worse than those of normal households. In the 1980s, she became the Secretary General of the Osaka main office, and in 1999, she took the post of the chairperson and has led the Association of Citizens since then. Besides being a core member of the survey delegations, she has negotiated with the Japanese Ministry of Health, Welfare and Labor, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has held lectures nationwide about the history and conditions of Korean hibakusha and has interacted with the members of the Korea Association, visiting their offices many times a year. In 2000, she published Hiroshima o Mochikaetta Hitobito, a book which significantly contributed to the scholarship on the history of Korean A-bomb victims. So she published this book. Next. So Hirano Nobuto was born in 1946 as a second-generation A-bomb survivor. He visited Seoul and Busan in 1987 as a representative of the group of second-generation A-bomb victims to speak out against nuclear weapons and spread awareness of the existence of A-bomb survivors. In South Korea, he noticed that although South Korean and Japanese hibakusha suffered the same human consequences of the A-bomb, their positions were fundamentally different. He said, in the case of Japan, nuclear weapons were used as a punishment for Japan's war of aggression, but Koreans had nothing to do with Japan's wartime atrocities. In fact, they were Japan's victims who happened to be in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the bomb was dropped. His interpretation was that South Korean and Japanese victims of the bomb are not the same hibakusha given their different backgrounds, which greatly shocked him. On visiting some Korean hibakusha homes, he was taken aback by witnessing their keloid scars and noticing that these people had never undergone any surgery. This experience prompted him to become active in supporting them. Hirano set up the Nagasaki branch of the Association of Citizens in 1992, and he has been one of the most committed members in support of Korean A-bomb victims. He delved into the situation of Korean hibakusha victimized in Nagasaki and searched for them in South Korea to inform them about their potential rights. While the Osaka Central Office mainly assisted hibakusha in South Korea, Hirano and the Nagasaki branch also supported Taiwanese, Brazilian, and other overseas hibakusha in their legal cases against the Japanese government. These advocates have been sympathetic toward Korean victims and have contributed to cooperative efforts to improve their situation. While it is a small grassroots organization that has never received any governmental support, the members' determination, hard work, and constant advocacy for the Korean hibakusha helped bring about changes in their status. One of the fundamental issues to be addressed was providing Korean hibakusha with medical assistance by Japanese medical experts who specialized in treating radiation-induced diseases. The Japanese and South Korean governments dealt with this problem through a bilateral agreement in 1980 that authorized subsidized medical treatment for Korean hibakusha in Japanese hospitals. After the Intergovernmental Medical Support Program began in 1981, South Korea sent a limited number of hibakusha to Japan for medical examinations and hospitalization over the next 6 years. According to the agreement, the maximum length for one person to stay in Japan was 2 months, but the Japanese government agreed to extend the period to 6 months when the patient's condition required prolonged hospitalization. The Japanese government covered the medical costs while South Korea provided the travel expenses. In total, 349 Korean A-bomb victims received medical treatment in the hospitals of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until September 1986. Nevertheless, since the Korea Association then had 9,000 registered members, the Intergovernmental Relief Program failed to address the overall hibakusha problem. Meanwhile, a Hiroshima-based doctor, Kawamura Torataro, set up the Hiroshima Committee to invite Korean A-bomb survivors to Japan for medical treatment. To make up for the shortcomings of the bilateral exchange program and bring those Korean hibakusha to Japan for repeated treatment whose ailments had recurred. Kawamura had been examining hibakusha in South Korea as a member of a medical delegation since 1971, and after witnessing the survivors' lack of access to proper medical treatment, he had been inviting them to his hospital mostly at his own expense since 1974. The committee gradually expanded nationwide, cooperated with South Korean and Japanese support associations, and succeeded in bringing 572 A-bomb survivors from South Korea to Japan in total until its closure in 2016. Taking the number of Korean hibakusha treated and the length of the program into consideration, the bottom line is that Japanese grassroots activism has been more effective in providing medical treatment than governmental efforts. So here you can see Dr. Kawamura Torataro on the left and his son, Dr. Kawamura Yuzuru, on the right. So when Dr. Kawamura Torataro passed away in 1987, it was his son, Kawamura Yuzuru, who continued to invite atomic bomb survivors from South Korea to his hospital in Hiroshima and continued their medical treatment. Kwak Kwi-hoon, a Hiroshima atomic bomb survivor living in Songnam, South Korea, filed a lawsuit in the Osaka District Court on October 1st, 1998, demanding the extension of the A-bomb relief law to overseas hibakusha. His legal journey can be regarded a turning point in the history of South Korean and other overseas A-bomb survivors. Following his legal victory in 2002, overseas hibakusha could assert their rights and gradually achieved parity with their Japanese counterparts against all odds through a series of subsequent litigations. The basis of Kwak Kwi-hoon's court victory required challenging a key Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare directive that was issued 24 years earlier. Despite the Fukuoka District Court's ruling in favor of Son Jin-doo in March 1974, overseas hibakusha were not granted equal rights with their Japanese counterparts. To prevent the proliferation of victimhood claims, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare passed Directive number 402 just months after the Fukuoka District Court decision. The ministry directive stipulated that the A-bomb special measures law is applicable to those hibakusha who reside inside the country, but once they leave Japan, the same law loses its validity. In other words, even if Koreans possessed an A-bomb certificate, once they returned to South Korea, they were excluded from the provisions guaranteed by the two A-bomb laws. This directive prevented Korean hibakusha possessing an A-bomb certificate who left Japan from receiving healthcare subsidies and other benefits for approximately 30 years, during which thousands died without receiving any assistance. By requesting the application of the A-bomb relief law to overseas hibakusha, Mr. Kwak also emphasized the illegal nature of Directive 402 and demanded its revocation. His words epitomized the ardent wish of foreign hibakusha to obtain equal rights and also served as a catalyst for American and Brazilian A-bomb survivors. He said, "As long as you stay in Japan, you are recognized as a hibakusha, but once you leave the country, you are not a hibakusha anymore. This kind of contradiction is nonsense. Hibakusha are hibakusha wherever they are." According to the Osaka District Court's ruling in favor of Kwak in June 2001, the A-bomb relief law remained applicable to hibakusha residing abroad. This encompassed their rights for medical and welfare benefits in their home countries under the auspices of the Japanese government. Additionally, the verdict declared that Directive 402 was a violation of the basic principles of the atomic bomb relief law. Following the government's appeal, the Osaka High Court upheld the district court's decision in favor of Kwak. As a result, the Ministry of Health abolished Directive 402 in March 2003, and with this, Mr. Kwak opened the door for overseas hibakusha to receive benefits from the Japanese government in their own countries. Nevertheless, this decision did not remove all barriers, and fighting to achieve equal treatment with their Japanese counterparts was a race against time for overseas hibakusha given their advanced age. Here you can see Mr. Kwak Kwi-hoon giving a speech, and on the right you can see his published book entitled "Hibakusha wa doko ni ite mo hibakusha," which is the Japanese title, and it means hibakusha are hibakusha wherever they are. After Mr. Kwak's legal victory, there was a surge in the number of survivors visiting Japan to apply for A-bomb certificates. The oldest hibakusha would have needed immediate medical treatment the most but their physical conditions barred them from enduring the long journey to Japan. Thus, many were repeatedly excluded from the benefits provided for A-bomb survivors possessing A-bomb certificates. To address this issue, the Japanese government amended the A-bomb relief law in June 2008. Its second article stipulates that the A-bomb victims outside Japan are entitled to apply for A-bomb certificates in their own countries at the nearest consulate or embassy. This was an essential yet another belated measure to extend the A-bomb relief law to the most vulnerable group of overseas hibakusha. Funeral service allowance was also crucial for closing the gap between overseas and Japanese hibakusha, and the bereaved families of overseas hibakusha were granted this right in 2005, following a legal victory at the Nagasaki District Court. In December 1995, 6 former Korean conscripted laborers who were also victims of the A-bomb and had been compelled to work for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries during World War II, filed a suit against the Japanese government and Mitsubishi, demanding national redress for the forced labor system, their unpaid wages, and for being abandoned as A-bomb survivors. The lawsuit dragged on 12 years, with the number of plaintiffs growing to 46, and on November 1st, 2007, the Japanese Supreme Court ruling ordered the government to compensate the plaintiffs with 1,200,000 yen per person for the exclusion of these overseas hibakusha from the medical services as a result of Directive 402. While the court acknowledged the illegal nature of the ministry directive, the plaintiffs received no compensation from Mitsubishi for their unpaid wages, so it was a partial victory for them. Overseas hibakusha also found it imperative to have the full amount of their medical expenses reimbursed by the Japanese government and remove the upper limit. This was the last major barrier that was broken down to bridge the gap between Japanese and foreign A-bomb survivors. The case reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Korean A-bomb victims on September 8, 2015. The verdict enabled all overseas hibakusha, except for those in North Korea, to apply for the full reimbursement of their medical expenses in their home countries from January 1st, 2016, sponsored by the Japanese government. This ruling finally resulted in a similar status for Japanese and overseas A-bomb survivors, but for many, it was already too late. It came 70 years after the dropping of the bomb, and during this period, thousands of Korean and other A-bomb victims had died amidst poverty, physical suffering, and feelings of resentment against Japan. Although the A-bomb relief law became applicable to overseas hibakusha in this series of legal cases, one group of survivors has never had any access to Japan's support measures, those residing in North Korea. This was due to the adversarial intergovernmental relations and lack of diplomatic ties between Japan and North Korea. Grassroots efforts in Japan to campaign for medical and welfare subsidies, led by Lee Shil-gun, facilitated the formation of the Association of North Korean A-bomb Survivors in 1995. North Korean hibakusha were issued A-bomb certificates only valid in North Korea, and survivors with certificates were prioritized in hospitals and received free medical treatment under the auspices of the North Korean government. Over the following 2 decades, the association conducted numerous fact-finding surveys to find out the numbers of North Korean A-bomb survivors. By 2007, they identified 1,911 hibakusha, of whom 382 were alive, while 1,529 had passed away. A follow-up survey revealed that of the 111 survivors examined until May 2018, only 60 were alive. Over 90,000 ethnic Koreans are estimated to have migrated from Japan to North Korea between 1959 and 1984 as part of the Japanese government's repatriation project. They fell victim to the post-war propaganda that claimed life in North Korea was prosperous. The country enticed people into moving there by offering transport, jobs, free housing, and welfare to returnees. Many Zainichi Koreans trapped in poverty and deprived of their Japanese citizenship, including nearly 2,000 hibakusha, were deceived by this propaganda and made the irrevocable decision to repatriate to North Korea. The Hiroshima Prefectural Medical Association delegation, with Usui Shizuteru as the chairperson, visited Pyongyang in September 2008 to examine A-bomb survivors there. They visited the Kim Man-yu Hospital, which is the sole medical institution in North Korea providing treatment for hibakusha. According to Dr. Usui, the X-ray machine and endoscope devices were obsolete, and the hospital resembled a Japanese institute from the 1980s. The Japanese medical delegation's observations confirm that North Korean hospitals lack modern technology and are inept at providing appropriate medical care for A-bomb victims. After their 2008 visit, the medical experts planned to carry on with their relief activities from a humanitarian stance, but they had to interrupt their program due to North Korea's nuclear test in May 2009. Currently, there is little prospect that North Korean A-bomb survivors, whose numbers have been decreasing rapidly, would ever receive any government-sponsored benefits their overseas counterparts have been entitled to. The antagonistic Japan-North Korea relations stemming from unresolved colonial issues, North Korea's abduction of Japanese citizens, and Japan's condemnation of North Korea's nuclear arsenal not only preclude the option of governmental support, but also hinder Japanese grassroots efforts from reaching out to the A-bomb sufferers in the world's most isolated country. Former US President Barack Obama confronted the past with his historic visit to Hiroshima on May 27, 2016, as the first sitting US president ever to enter the city obliterated by a single atomic bomb dropped by his country. In his speech, Obama said, "We come to mourn the dead, including over 100,000 Japanese men, women, and children, thousands of Koreans, a dozen Americans held prisoner. It was broadcast worldwide and provided an opportunity for millions of people to learn about the existence of atomic bomb victims other than the Japanese for the first time. Although President Obama referred to the A-bombed Koreans, he was vague about their actual numbers. The Korea Association estimates that there were approximately 50,000 Koreans in Hiroshima and 20,000 in Nagasaki at the time of the bombings. In the sense, President Obama's momentous speech could have been more explicit in just how large the actual numbers of Koreans were in Hiroshima. In 1996, the Hapcheon Welfare Center for Atomic Bomb Victims was built that has accommodated approximately 100 A-bomb survivors since then. On August 6, 2017, the Atomic Bomb Museum opened to the public adjacent to the Hapcheon Welfare Center. This is the very first peace museum in South Korea dedicated to atomic bomb victims and the third one globally after those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 years later, in 2019, the East Building of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum reopened following a long renovation, incorporating an exhibition space about overseas hibakusha for the first time. Kwak Kwi-hoon, upon his visit to the newly opened museum, praised the display as historical progress and claimed people from other countries were also affected by the atomic bombing. I want the exhibition to spread this fact that cannot be countered by anyone. Despite the success of overseas hibakusha lawsuits, some survivors still have difficulty obtaining atomic bomb certificates. Hwang Ban-ja, a 76-year-old A-bomb survivor from Seoul, was 8 months old at the time of the Hiroshima bombing and stayed 1.2 kilometers from the hypocenter. She wanted to receive healthcare subsidy from the Japanese government after recovering from colon cancer surgery in 2017 and was seeking assistance in Japan. Members of the Hiroshima branch office of the Association of Citizens responded to her request and submitted her application for the healthcare subsidy at the Hiroshima City Hall that was later approved. Wang's case illustrates that overseas hibakusha have been able to assert their rights even 7 decades after the atomic bomb attack, but to do so, it has been imperative for them to gain the support of Japanese grassroots organizations devoted to fighting for the equal rights of all A-bomb victims residing in Japan. So here on the left, you can see the Hapcheon Welfare Center for the atomic bomb victims. And on the right, the newly opened Atomic Bomb Museum. Tracing the history of South Korean hibakusha demonstrates the power of Japanese grassroots networks and sheds light on the most important legal case that led the Japanese government to recognize the rights of some of its wartime and colonial victims in the wake of a decades-long journey through the courts. The memory of their suffering from the atomic bombings has been affirmed through multiple litigations against the Japanese government, during which they gained the support of thousands of Japanese. This paper delves into ways that these Japanese broke away from the post-war constraints of the victim-centric narrative that previously had only dealt with Japanese hibakusha. The movement for legal justice for Korean hibakusha has helped alleviate some of the trauma of colonization, in addition to the main objective of obtaining treatment for the physical injuries they suffered from the atomic bombings. The significance of this study lies in the fact that the example of Japanese grassroots cooperation or the support of South Korean hibakusha suggests there are alternative critical approaches at historical reconciliation between South Korea and Japan. When he was the mayor of Hiroshima in the 1990s, Hiroka Takashi repeatedly emphasized his country's crucial role of self-reflection. He said, "Unless we ask ourselves the question of why people from the Korean peninsula suffered from the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and make efforts to respond to this question, the peace that Hiroshima has advocated will not capture people's minds in Asia." At the 1995 Peace Triangle Summit in Naha, he further stated, "We have insisted that using nuclear weaponry violates international law due to its indiscriminate and atrocious character. Yet, without self-reflection and apology for the war, the appeal to abolish nuclear weapons will not be commonly embraced." Acknowledging the rights of South Korean hibakusha indicates that Japan is beginning to face its imperial past, pressured by grassroots circles. The case of South Korean hibakusha in this historical and social context brings to light the significance of Japanese civil society activism, and in turn can serve as a model to resolve other unsettled wartime issues, as well as contributing to paving the way for a more peaceful future for Japan as a full-fledged member of the Asian community. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to end the presentation with the photo of the monument in memory of the Korean victims of the atomic bomb at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park that I took a couple of years ago. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. That was great. If anyone has questions, we can take them now. You can use the raise hand function, or if your camera's on, you can raise your hand, or you can enter the question into the chat box. Okay. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, very good presentation, Ágota.
Thank you very much.
I want to ask you a question on something you left out. It involves the last picture, the monument to Korean victims. Do you know much? Can you talk about the history of that, in that it was not allowed in the Peace Park for a long time or something, and how what was the movement that got it moved into the Peace Park?
Oh, thank you very much. It's a very important question. Actually, I was planning to talk about the monument, but I thought the presentation would be very long. So when anyone was interested in this issue, I was happy to tell more about it. So concerning the Korean monument in the Peace Memorial Park, it was established in 1970 by Mindan, which is the support group, which is the South Korea affiliated group in Japan. And for a long time, it was placed outside the official territory of the Peace Memorial Park. And there are several theories why it happened like this. So many people say that it was a discrimination against the Korean people, that the monument was outside the official Peace Park territory. But according to a law, by then, no more monuments could be included in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. And actually, the monument was first erected at a place where a Korean prince died after the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. So many people thought that this place would be suitable for the monument. However, there was a movement, certainly starting from the 1990s, to include the monument inside the Peace Park, because if it's outside, if it's isolated, then not many people are focusing on it. Not many visitors know about its existence when they visit Hiroshima and the Peace Memorial Park. So there was a movement. Well, actually, I'm not very familiar with the history of the movement, but I know that it happened during the time when Hiroka Takashi was Hiroshima's mayor, and he was a really progressive mayor. So due to his efforts and maybe Mindan's cooperation, the monument could be placed inside the official Peace Memorial Park to its current place in 1999.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a question here, well, from Bo Jacobs. And it says, my question for Ágota is, do you sense any change for the place of Korean hibakusha in Korean society as the generation that lived through World War II passes? Many tensions held by earlier generations are easing as time passes.
Very good question. Thank you very much for bringing up this issue. I'd like to ask the Korean participants today about the awareness of this issue in South Korea, because since I am based in Japan, I've never conducted any surveys in South Korea concerning the awareness of the history of South Korean hibakusha and their existence. But I think that so nowadays, yeah, the average age of the survivors is over 80, so it's about 83, if I'm not mistaken. And it means that many of the people have already passed away. So and most of those Korean hibakusha who live in South Korea now, they managed to get an A-bomb certificate in Japan, so they are entitled to receive social and medical benefits from the Japanese government, and they are largely assisted by their own association in South Korea and the Japanese support movements. So because of this growing assistance and raising awareness on their history and suffering, I think their historical perception of Japan has, and this feeling of resentment has largely changed for the better. Absolutely. Was it an answer to your question?
He hasn't typed out an answer.
Oh, please take your time. Oh, and I forgot to mention, actually I mentioned it in the presentation, that a small peace museum opened in Hapcheon, next to the Hapcheon Welfare Center. So in 2017, 4 years ago. So although it came 72 years after the dropping of the bomb, but at least now there is a memorial place for the history of Korean hibakusha. So absolutely, it means that there is a raising awareness in Korean society on their sufferings and abandonment.
This is actually something I've studied, and I don't know how things have changed in the past few years, but I examined middle school and high school textbooks in Korean, and there is no mention. Actually, there's no mention of the atomic bombs usually. World War II gets a 2-page spread in these textbooks. It's separated from Korean history. It's a part of international history, and the Pacific War gets 1 page. That's it. And there might be a mention sort of among atrocities of the war, like the Holocaust might get a little tiny thing like this, and the atomic bombings. I only ever found 1 mention in a high school textbook that Koreans had been victims of the atomic bombs. So it seems like it's something that's not well known. And even a few years ago, there was a Jungang Ilbo columnist who wrote a rather inflammatory column in which he talked about the vivisection experiments by Unit 732 in Manchuria, and how they referred to the victims as maruta, as logs. And this columnist said, the atomic bombings were God's revenge for the maruta. And there was an outcry, and from, of course, the Japanese government, I think the embassy, and so he apologized to all the Japanese. But at the same time, there was a press release by the 2nd generation Korean victim group. And guess how many Korean newspapers published anything from that press release? 0.
Zero.
So he certainly wasn't apologizing to the Koreans who were there. So if there's going to be a change, it'll be a quite slow and incremental one. Hopefully someone will make a movie at some point that would bring it into consciousness, honestly.
I will do my best to publish as many papers as possible and also a book in the future in this topic. So hopefully it will raise some awareness.
Good. Samuel, you had a question? You had your hand up?
Yes, I thank you, Professor, for a very interesting talk. I was just curious if there's any lessons to be learned for the current struggle by the comfort women in Korea, and if any of these these organizations in Japan that were involved with the hibakusha, if there's any overlap at all, and any shared, concerns and lessons that might be brought to this other issue.
Oh, thank you. It's a very important question. I think there is some overlap, and I know that some members of this of the Hibakusha Support Association also supports stand up for the rights for the Korean comfort women, but compared to the number of supporters of Korean hibakusha, I think this is just a minority movement in Japan, and it is not powerful enough to bring the case to court. And yeah, maybe an international cooperation would be necessary to reach to achieve justice or bring justice to the Korean comfort women. But yeah, given their advanced age right now, there is little prospect that it will ever happen. And there is very little awareness on this issue in Japan, because most people, not most people, but some people belonging to the extreme right, even deny the existence of the comfort women issue.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I just didn't know how much of an overlap might exist there.
Oh.
Sure. Any more questions? Yes, Mickey.
Hey, Ágota, thank you for your presentation. That was
Thank you
really
for
cool.
coming, Mickey.
Hi, it's been too much. It's been so long, and thank you everyone. I was born and raised in Hiroshima, and I am a third generation of hibakusha, and also studied peace things with Ágota in 2013 in Hiroshima, and also I still remember the day Mr. Obama visited Japan, and also he just, that was really meaningful event that Mr. Obama came to Japan and also came to Hiroshima. That was very meaningful for Hiroshima people as well. And yeah, I just wanted to share. I won't forget the day he visited. And also I went to the Peace Memorial Museum, and I don't remember. That was maybe in 2018 or something. And I saw so many, pictures and also drawing that Korean victims, and also U.S. military person held by Japanese military, and they got exposed by the radiation, and I saw all kind of things, and I thought that was really really hurt. That really hurt for me as well, and I just wanted to share this feeling to everyone. Thank you, Ágota, so much.
Thank you for your comment, Miki. Yeah, I really appreciate that you're here. So yeah, in 2013, as Miki said, we studied peace together, studied about peace together in Hiroshima. We participated in the summer university program of Hiroshima City University called Hiroshima and Peace. And it was an intensive 2-week course. And yeah, actually it provided me with the opportunity to come back to Hiroshima and continue my research on the atomic bombing. And this was when I discovered actually the existence of Korean A-bomb survivors.
Are there any more questions? John posted in the comments an article I wrote for the Korea Times a couple years ago about the Korean survivors that might be of interest. It's quite a bit shorter and less detailed than your presentation.
Oh, thank you. I will definitely read it.
I was curious, the sense I had of the atomic bomb victims that were in North Korea was that most of them had come from the late 50s repatriation.
Yes, that's right. Not all of them, but yeah, most of them.
It just seems, yeah, like the rest of them, yeah, had seemed to originally have mostly come from Southern Korea. So that's where they returned to.
Yes, it's very interesting. So originally when they were forced to move to Japan during the Second World War, or before the Second World War. They were, yeah, from the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, and it was interesting that they were deceived by this post-war propaganda, offering many opportunities in North Korea, and this is why they decided to move to the northern part. And they were not aware of the oppressive policies there at the time. So it was very surprising discovery for me as well.
Right. Yeah, it's a very sad story of not being able to have any contact with them in the past.
That's right.
Decade or more. Yeah.
And that although all these support measures are now extended to all overseas hibakusha, only those in North Korea have no access to those relief measures or benefits provided by the Japanese government because of the non-existence of diplomatic ties between the two countries. So it's a really sad history. They are the victims of this political conflict between the two countries.
Mark.
Yeah, concerning that, I was surprised that 2,000 hibakusha were sent to North Korea at this time. It isn't the Japanese repatriate; it was the North Koreans who initiated this talk, and I think it was because the Chinese laborers were leaving, and they needed people to help rebuild North Korea after the Korean War, and the radical section of the Koreans in Japan, not the Mindan, was responsible for choosing these people and sending them over, convincing them to go to North Korea. They played a big part in it. And it might be that they're saying, well, let's get rid of these people, you know. So they're really victims of within Japan as well as North Korea. And I always wondered, Kim Il-sung said he'll give you free education and blah, blah, blah. I don't know if he expected 90,000 Koreans to migrate to North Korea. He might have been overwhelmed, and of course we don't know the answer to that. He's dead, and unless some document shows up. But there's a good book. I just sent you an email, but Tessamura Suzuki wrote a book called Exodus to North Korea. And it's very readable, and it's like a travel guide. She goes to the UN in Geneva. She goes to North Korea. She looks at documents all over the world, and it's more of my travels to find these people who were sent to North Korea. So very, very readable, but very, very informative. And that would give you a good idea of what the story is better than I could, but at any rate, it is a tragic story, and I'm surprised that 2,000 hibakusha were sent, and I can't believe it's anything more than let's get rid of these people, you know. And any rate.
Thank you very much. I will definitely check out the book you have mentioned.
Yeah, it's a good book. I'll send it down to you if you can't find it.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I'm planning to write an academic article in the hopefully near future, not in the distant future, on the history of hibakusha in North Korea, because yeah, there are only a few sources on South Korean hibakusha, but basically there is none on the history of those who repatriated to the north and their situation. So absolutely no information. And yeah, I was lucky because I could, from some activists here in Hiroshima, I received some books actually on their history and testimonies. So it was reading those sources about the history of North Korean A-bomb victims was really eye-opening for me. And I really like to raise awareness on this issue too. Although I know that there is no hope that they will ever receive any benefits from the Japanese government.
That's be a very difficult article. You should talk with Moses, the Hungarian ambassador, because he said you might have good resources in Hungary. He's been able to find some good resources of North Korea in Hungary because of the North Korean Eastern Europe connection. And so you might, because you can, I'm assuming you can read Hungarian.
Oh yeah, sure.
You might find some good documents in Hungary, and he'd be able to tell you where to get them, because that's what he's been doing research on. Hungarians who came to North Korea. His field is that he's given talks on the 90 days that North Korea occupied Seoul during the Korean War. And but so you should get to know him.
Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really hope that, yeah, I will have the chance to meet him in person one day.
Send him an email. He's not an old folk. He's a young guy and a scholar.
Are there any other questions for Ágota? Okay, why don't we say thank you again to Ágota for this great presentation. Here I'm just going to share some information about the Royal Asiatic Society upcoming events. On Thursday, June 17th at 7:30, there will be the next online meeting of the Literature Club, and it will be about Bae Myung-hoon's futuristic novel Tower. So that will be discussed, and print copies are available from several sources, including an ebook version that is available on Amazon. As well, June 10th at 6 p.m. online is the colloquium, and that will feature Brother Anthony, the President Emeritus of RAS Korea, and he will be lecturing on the topic Korean Poetry and Fiction in English Translation, a Personal Survey. And on June 15th at noon will be the Business and Culture Club. The group will wander through the current renovations to Gwanghwamun Plaza, and the meeting point will be at exit 7 of Gwanghwamun Station on line 5. And our next lecture, lecture 1444, will be on June 22nd and by Director Kim Jung-bae of the Exhibition Division of the National Palace Museum of Korea. Before joining the National Palace Museum, Director Kim worked at the Korea Land and Housing Corporation for 23 years as a heritage expert who conserved heritage sites and mediated between conservation and development of cities and the industrial complex. He was trained as an archaeologist and attained a master's degree at Hanyang University. For the last 30 years, from 1989, he has examined archaeological sites and reported to the Academy. So he'll be talking on June 22nd. So please check our website and YouTube channel where you can find recordings of past lectures and other useful content. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again for your lecture and your attendance tonight and questions, and good night.
Thank you very much.